Michael Clark is a professor of defense studies. He was a director of the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Clark.
Yeah, thank you. It's very nice to be with you.
If the UK Prime Minister gave the order, Moscow would be destroyed. That's what you said in your latest interview on Times Radio. As Russian dictator Vladimir Putin continues to threaten a total war with NATO, do you feel that Russians really remember that NATO also has its own nuclear weapons?
Well, if you listen to the Russians who speak on state-sponsored and state-controlled television every night of the week, you would think that they didn't realize that NATO had its own nuclear weapons. And I merely made the point that Britain has an independent nuclear deterrent, and whether you like that or not, and some people are very opposed to it, and I understand absolutely why, and I'm uncomfortable about the British nuclear deterrent, but it's a straight technological fact that at any given moment of the day or night, there is a nuclear submarine somewhere under the North Atlantic, and if any British Prime Minister gave the order for it to fire, then it would fire its missiles 55 minutes after the order was given. And when you look at the number of warheads that it would be delivering, about 40, it wouldn't matter how many Russian air defenses might manage to shoot down, enough would get through to devastate Moscow. Every single warhead is about six times bigger than the warhead of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So that's just a straight technological fact. That is what nuclear deterrence is. It's extremely unpleasant to think about it, but that is the world in which we live. And when you listen to the way some Russians and people like Sergei Karaganov, who I used to know reasonably well, when you listen to what he says about the idea that Russia should be prepared to use nuclear weapons against European targets, they seem to forget that we are in a situation of mutual nuclear deterrence.
Does it mean that Russian capital and Russia is vulnerable to the NATO's nuclear weapons?
Well, the Russian capital is absolutely vulnerable to British nuclear weapons. I mean, the fact is that British nuclear weapons are targeted according to the NATO plan, which is part of the American SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. So in any general war, British nuclear weapons would be used according to NATO's requirements. So they wouldn't necessarily be targeted at Moscow. If Moscow decided to launch a nuclear attack on Britain, then Britain's weapons, I can promise you, are all going to Moscow. That's been the doctrine since the early 1960s, and that's what would happen. If it was a question of Russia and Britain in some sort of crazy nuclear crisis, then all of our weapons would be targeted on Moscow, for sure.
From your perspective, would Putin's nuclear threats deter Western leaders from allowing Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with Western-made weapons, ATACMS or Storm Shadow cruise missiles?
Well, they already do. I think it's fair to say that Russia's nuclear threats don't make much impression in Britain, and they don't make much impression on our colleagues in the Scandinavian states or in the Baltic states, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. But they make some impression on some of our colleagues in other European countries, and they do affect public opinion. And you can see the effect of that certainly in Germany. You can see it in countries like Italy and some of the southern European countries. So it is a sad fact, I think, that just threatening nuclear weapons in the rather reckless way that Putin and some other members of his inner circle do on a regular basis, that has affected opinion in some Western countries among some sections of the public. And so in a peculiar way, it shows that nuclear deterrence works, that if you threaten it often enough, some people will start to guide their policy according to they're frightened of it. And undoubtedly, the idea of letting Ukraine use its Western supplied weapons to strike deeper into Russia against military targets. One of the reasons why some Western politicians are still very wary of that is the general fear of escalation. And behind the fear of escalation is the prospect that maybe at some point further down the line, we might be involved in a nuclear crisis. Now, I think that's very far-fetched, personally. I'm not too bothered about that. We should always be careful about nuclear escalation. It's far too serious to be casual about it. but it seems to me that the Russians are getting a very cheap victory by talking recklessly and frightening quite a number of politicians and public in some countries in the West and in the United States to create this sense that we've got to support Ukraine, but not give Ukraine the weapons it needs to really prevail in its own defense. And that seems to me to be a very contradictory and confusing policy on the part of many Western countries.
Also, in one of your interviews on Times Radio, you said that ATACMS or Storm Shadow missiles could be used in Russia within weeks. Do you feel that this decision has already been made by Western allies?
No, I think it's a decision which will be influenced by what happens next week at the UN General Assembly in New York. President Zelensky will be there. He will be having more talks with President Biden and the American administration. He's presenting his plan for the future, his expectations for how the war will be conducted by Ukraine. And there's a lot of intensive diplomacy going on behind the scenes, including from my own country. My own government in Britain is working the telephones pretty hard, talking to allies around the NATO alliance. And I think that if there is a breakthrough on this issue of the use of Western long-range weapons inside Russia, if there is to be a breakthrough, I think it will occur probably next week and be announced in the days following that. So when I say that I think that they will be authorized for use in the coming weeks, I have in mind something like the week after next. And I personally would be very disappointed if that doesn't take place. I can't guarantee it. I'm just guessing. But I would be very disappointed if there is not an authorization for the use of long-range weapons against strictly military targets inside Russia, and military targets which have a direct bearing on Russia's invasion and war inside Ukraine, and on the basis of a target set that can be offered to the Western allies for their approval. I think Ukraine has made it very clear that, look, these are all the targets we are thinking about. If you tell us that certain of these targets are not possible, then maybe we'll take them off the target list. But, we'll do everything we need to do to reassure you that this is a purely military response. And I think that's what President Zelensky and his staff are likely to be saying to the United States next week. And personally, I hope they succeed.
What are they negotiating on? On what kind of weapons would be used, like ATACMS or Storm Shadow missiles, or on any kind of terms for this decision?
Yeah, I think there are four missiles or four systems which are particularly important to Ukraine here. One is Storm Shadow, and Britain would like to be able to authorize Storm Shadow, and for other reasons of targeting, it really needs American approval. I mean, Britain could give approval to Kiev to use Storm Shadow now, and they could be used. Technically, they could be fired, but the chances are they wouldn't penetrate Russian air defenses without American help in the way they are targeted. I think there's a technical issue there. But Storm Shadow is the most likely, and Scalp is the French version of Storm Shadow. The second one is ATACMS, which are a ground-launched ballistic missile, and they would be very effective because they're very hard to defend against, whereas Storm Shadow is a cruise missile traveling at about the speed of an aircraft. ATACMS is a ballistic missile traveling at the speed of a falling missile, which makes it very difficult to defend against. So ATACMS are the second one that are really important. There's the next one is called a JASMS, which is, again, an American missile. Again, it's a very good form of missile, and there's quite a lot of interest in allowing the JASMS missile to be authorized and supplied to Ukraine. And the fourth one is the Taurus, the German missile, which Germany has ruled out again and again supplying to Ukraine. Taurus will be very good. They are more useful to Ukraine than Storm Shadow. And the German Chancellor has said they will not be supplied. The elements of the German government think they should be. Germany, as usual, is split on this. Germany is dithering over it. But Chancellor Scholz absolutely rules it out for the foreseeable future. We'll see if that lasts, because he changes his mind on lots of things. But so far, Germany has said no to the supply of Taurus missiles. And I mean, above all, what Ukraine needs is whichever missiles or systems may be authorized. The key question is numbers. I mean, authorizing a dozen of them or 20 or 30 is not the point. They need several hundred in order to be able to put up a regular barrage against Russian military facilities, which will keep their air power back. It'll keep the Russians away from the frontier and make it more difficult for Russian glide bombs and ballistic missiles, very often these North Korean ballistic missiles, these Iranian ballistic missiles that are being thrown into Ukraine, both at civilian targets and at military targets.
Are Western allies capable of providing Ukraine with hundreds of such long-range assets? And do you feel that there is a political will to provide Ukraine with such a large amount of long-range assets, long-range capabilities?
The Europeans alone could provide, let's say, a few hundred, but only the United States could provide several hundred or into the, let's say, 1,000 systems. And that's the case, I'm afraid, across the board in all, whether we're talking about artillery ammunition, 155 millimeter shells, small arms ammunition, aircraft, whatever it is, we look to the United States if we're looking for high numbers. And it will take some time for the Europeans to ramp up their own production to be able to give more than, not small numbers, but limited numbers of systems to Ukraine. And again, in the summer of 2022, people like me said that there will be a munitions crisis by spring of 2023, because it was clear that Western arsenals were quite small. Our production capacity had shrunk over the last 20 odd years. Governments were not placing orders for more ammunition. And it was no surprise, absolutely no surprise, that we ran into a munitions crisis over the winter of 2022-23. And here we are now in the winter of 24-25, and it's only just beginning to ease because the orders that politicians put in, but European politicians put in last year are beginning to pay off. But even those orders are too small to meet the demands that are likely to arise next year in 2025.
How do you see the main obstacle for this decision to be made right now? Is this obstacle in the White House, in the United States?
I think in the United States' case, the main obstacle is in the White House. I think Joe Biden has opinions from different views. It's generally regarded as understood that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is generally speaking in favor of giving Ukraine longer range missiles. And Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor, is much more cautious. And I think Biden himself tends to be more cautious because he's thinking about not just the good of Europe and Ukraine, he's thinking about his place in history and the danger of a war that could spin out of control in the last 3 or 4 months of his presidency. So I think that the main obstacle there is really the opinion of the White House. The opinions in the Pentagon seem more consistently pro-supply than anti-supply. But then in Europe, there is a real split. Insofar as it matters, Britain is very much in favor of Ukraine having long-range systems. France is fairly clear on that as well, but other European partners are not. And again, I mean, German attitudes are critical, not just because of the Taurus missile, but because I think German hesitancy affects other European nations, because Germany is a very important country in Europe, and Britain now is not part of the European Union, so we have less influence than we used to have. Even within NATO, our influence is less than it might be because of Brexit, leaving the European Union. So in that respect, we have diminished our own influence in defense and security, as in so many other things, by leaving the European Union. So Germany's hesitancy has a psychological effect on other European countries, not just within Germany itself, but on other partners. And the danger is that the Europeans, again, as always, look to the United States for the lead. If the US takes the lead, Europe will eventually follow, generally speaking. If the United States is not prepared to take the lead, the Europeans are not united enough to take over the lead from the United States. And that's been the issue for the last 40 odd years. It may well be different. Whoever wins the US presidential election in November, I think the future of US-European relations will be very different in the future. But it is still the case that the Europeans talk a good game. They talk very assertively about what they will do, but really they only really do it when they can line up behind the United States.
Does this makes any sense for the US only to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia only with UK's Storm Shadow cruise missiles, but not with ATACMS missiles? Does it make any sense?
Well, it would allow the United States to say that these are European missiles, and what the Europeans choose to allow Ukraine to do with them is up to them. So it gives them a degree of distance from any decision. I don't think and the Russians would pretend that that didn't have any effect on it one way or another. They'd say that America is fully to blame for this policy of allowing Ukraine to strike into our country. It might have a little bit of an effect inside the Kremlin, because it would show that the United States is still very cautious about challenging Putin and challenging all this reckless commentary that Putin constantly makes about the war. So I can see there is a certain logic in the United States saying to Britain and France, okay, supply Storm Shadow and Scalp, we'll live with that, and we'll give you some minimal help, or give the Ukrainians some minimal help with the targeting. But you can't have JTACMS. You can't have the missile that the ATACMS, sorry, the missile that you really want, because that would be too escalatory. I can see there's a sort of logic to that, but it's a very fine distinction. And I think if the United States is to say we are happy with long-range strikes into Russia, then they should be happy with any NATO weapons that are able to do that.
Don't you think that such cautiousness of the White House would only reward Putin's reckless actions?
Yes, that's exactly what happens, is that every time we refuse to take on the responsibilities of backing Ukraine in this war, we reward Putin's aggression and recklessness. And I've said from the very beginning, we all know that we're going to cross these thresholds, that escalation has been built into this crisis since February 2022. And I've always said that. And this crisis will get more dangerous yet before we can see an end to it. And we just have to accept that, and we have to try to manage it. And so, every time we reach a threshold, while supplying Ukraine with multiple launch rocket systems, supplying Ukraine with tanks, supplying Ukraine with F-16s, we wait at the threshold, and then we cross it too little and too late to make a real difference. If we cross these thresholds earlier and more clearly and more bravely, then Ukraine would be in a much better position now. But the crisis would be that much more dangerous now than it already is. But in my view, we've got to accept that. I think this crisis cannot be contained at a low level, or if it is, then Ukraine will lose a lot of territory and is on the slope to being eliminated as an independent country.
Do you see Russia's red lines as an unreal one?
In effect, they are. Putin constantly talks about red lines, and then when they're crossed, he makes fierce commentary but doesn't do any more. Because I always say to people, particularly in Britain, they say, will Putin do this, Putin do that? And I say, look, he's doing his worst as things stand. He's doing all he can to destroy Ukraine, even as we speak. So what more can he do? If he could do more, he would. But the fact is, he's doing his maximum as things stand. And Russia's war economy is not performing terribly well, and it's probably not going to perform particularly well next year. I mean, the issue is that Putin has put Russia into a war economy, and that will last probably for a generation. And that means that Russian economic development will ultimately be held back by being a permanent war economy. But it also, and that's a bad thing for Europe in general, and we're going to have to live with that. But it also means that this war economy of Putin's is going to start to perform really quite badly, I think, even on the battlefield from about spring of 2025, that there are lots of problems, and Putin will be increasingly dependent on supplies from abroad. And if the West was really determined about this, we could do quite a lot about preventing those supplies from North Korea and Iran. We can make it much more expensive for North Korea and Iran and China to provide components for Russian-made weapons. And I think there's an urge in the Biden administration to begin to take on that issue, to try to chase the sanctions breaking around the world. And I think that the Biden administration will try to do quite a lot of that between now and January, when Biden, whoever wins the election, President Biden will step down. And I think one of his legacies will want to be that he ran an effective sanctions campaign against Russia. And sanctions campaigns, you have to keep on at them. You can't just announce sanctions and then sit back and do nothing, because all sanctions can be evaded. So having announced sanctions, you've then got to chase the evasions. You've got to keep closing loopholes. You've got to keep making it more expensive for the sanctions evaders to evade the regulations. And that's what the Americans are gearing up much more to do. So is the European Union, but they will probably have to do a lot more of it in the next 12 months or so. And it may be more effective in the next 12 months or so as the Russian war economy plateaus during 2025.
Also, there was an interesting piece by Reuters. Vladimir Putin's options to retaliate if the West lets Ukraine use long-range missiles to strike Russia could include striking British military assets, military installations near Russia, or conducting a nuclear test. Three analysts told this Reuters. What kind of consequences could Russia face if it strikes British military installations near Russia?
Well, if British military installations are targeted, we would treat it in the way that we treat any such attack. It's criminality, and I think British military installations are really quite well defended, and we're quite good at tracking down criminals, Russian criminals who operate in our territory. We know exactly what happened in the Litvinenko poisoning in 2006. We know exactly what happened in the case of Skripal in 2018. And although the perpetrators had disappeared back to Russia by the time we found out very quickly, and there were consequences. The Russians were not allowed to get away with it in a diplomatic sense. So if the Russians began to think about targeting, British air bases or British naval bases, I think they would find that they would not escape, they would not get away. And Britain, I don't think we would overreact. We would just treat it as the same sort of criminality as we saw in 2006 and 2018. And we're already subject to that, where we suffer regular attempted cyber attacks, lots and lots of ransomware attacks, the vast majority of which are originated either within Russia or from groups that Russia supports outside Russia. And we're subjected to a certain degree of attempted sabotage. So we're on the alert for that. And in a way, I don't think it will be strategically significant. It would be inconvenient and expensive to do something about it. But I'm fairly confident that British security services are it's one of the strengths that we've got. We have lots and lots of weaknesses in Britain, but one of our strengths is counter-terrorism, counter-espionage, and counter-sabotage. Well, we're actually quite good at that.
Let's cover also Ukraine's biggest attack on Russia's ammunition depot in Tver. This attack triggered earthquake-sized blast in Russia. What is your take on this major attack on Russia's ammunition depot?
Yeah, it was a spectacular. I mean, anything that registers 2.2 on the Richter scale has got to be good, in the sense that it means that it's militarily effective. And the report is that this was a storage base for a lot of the weaponry that Russia is getting from North Korea and possibly Iran. So that has to be a good hit for Ukraine, and it will have set back Russia's ammunition supplies, I think, fairly considerably. What's interesting, certainly sitting in Britain, is because the Gaza crisis and the issue of Lebanon and Hezbollah is now top of the agenda, not many people have noticed how important a strike that was from however Ukraine did it, and we can speculate about drones and sabotage and so on, but Ukraine undoubtedly has created this massive explosion, and it received very little coverage, certainly in Britain, because everyone's attention was directed on the Middle East.
What is your take on the current situation in the Kursk region? How do you see the current Ukraine's strategy there?
It's a dangerous strategy because if it goes wrong, then Ukraine could lose both men and equipment in Kursk, as well as losing Pokrovsk in the south without having relieved the pressure. And if that were to happen, it hasn't happened, but if it were to happen, I think President Zelensky and Commander General Syrsky would both be under a fair bit of internal pressure in Kiev. And I think that's obviously a danger for them. But the Kursk offensive is still ongoing. It started on the 6th of August, and so that's now 6 weeks ago, more than 6 weeks ago. And the operation seems to me to be moving sideways. Interestingly, Ukrainian troops are not trying to go forward. They're going sideways inside Russian territory, which keeps their flanks quite limited, short, and it gives them a good escape route back over their own side of the border if they should need it. And I think we will see an uptick in Ukrainian activity in Kursk in the next 2 weeks. And the reason I say that is because I think Ukrainians were waiting to see the Russian counterattack, which took place and has got as far as Snodgust. I may not have pronounced that correctly, but
yes,
you will know where I mean.
Snodgust,
yeah.
something like this.
Snodgust, yeah. And they haven't. The Ukrainians have held there, and it looks as if more Ukrainian forces are moving in to take the pocket further westwards, and also further southeastwards. So, and I think one of the reasons for that is probably because President Zelensky will be going to Washington next week. I think that the sense that Ukraine is still fighting successfully in Kursk will be an important political indicator when he is in New York and has discussions with President Biden and the team. But the overall calculation is still a dangerous one, which is that if Ukraine loses Pokrovsk, and it has not lost it yet, although Russia is now within artillery range, but if Ukraine loses Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, which is the high ground, which dominates the approach to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, then the distraction of Kursk may look like a strategic mistake. But if it doesn't lose Pokrovsk, doesn't lose Chasiv Yar, and the Kursk operation is able to continue into the end of October, early November, and therefore maybe then persist during the winter, then I think that Ukraine has quite a lot to gain in the longer run from the Kursk operation. But the bottom line is, it was a dangerous and risky thing to do. I hope it pays off.
We hope too. Also, Vladimir Putin is under pressure to conduct another mobilization campaign, according to the Wall Street Journal. Also, there is a big deficit, big shortage of the human resources in Russia, according to this media outlet. How harmful could be another mobilization campaign for Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely does not want to do it because the partial mobilization of 2022 was actually very dangerous for him politically and didn't make enough of a difference in Ukraine itself. If he went in for another partial or even a full mobilization, I think he's in uncharted territory because, as I put it, he'd be market testing his whole narrative of this war. He'd be having to convince the Russian people that this is a war for the survival of Russia against the West, not a war of aggression against Ukraine, which we all know it really is. However, I don't think he's on the verge of doing it, and I don't think he would need to do it until maybe next year, because the Russians are being reasonably successful at buying people in, foreigners, people from other parts of Russia, who for these enormous bonuses and salaries are prepared to take their chances. And although that creates enormous problems on the front line, both with soldiers who are getting the normal pay and these soldiers who are getting 2 and 3 times the rate of pay, that causes resentment. It brings more soldiers in who are not particularly well trained. They're just cannon fodder. So there are problems with that. But I think that the Russians will try to get through the rest of this year and into next year without mobilization, simply by buying in more forces from abroad and from other eastern parts of Russia. In 2025, if Ukraine is militarily successful, as I think, I believe, and I hope it will be in the spring of 2025, then Putin will be faced with a need to announce some sort of mobilization. But I don't personally believe it is likely, or the pressure won't build up really on Putin until after the winter, because I think they feel as if they can maintain numbers for the time being just by paying lots of money for them.
And let's cover also our final topic, the situation on the Middle East. The Israeli attack caused thousands of Hezbollah pagers to explode across Lebanon. How exactly Israel managed to conduct this attack, and how could it influence the future warfare, future secret operations?
Yeah, I've been asked that by a couple of broadcasters, and they say, "Isn't it? What does this mean?" And I say to them, "Well, welcome to the future. This is what warfare will tend to look like, which is where a whole society can be affected in ways it didn't imagine because of the vulnerabilities of modern society to electronics and digital systems." The way the Israelis seem to have done it, in my latest understanding, and this is in the public domain now, is that the Taiwanese company that produced the pages are said to have supplied them to this Hungarian company called BAC. Now, BAC look as if they were actually an Israeli shell company. And what was actually happening, whatever the Taiwanese company thought, who were Global Apollo, whatever they thought, what was actually happening is that the Israelis were producing the pages themselves, physically manufacturing them themselves, and making it look as if they were Global Apollo pages subcontracted to BAC in Hungary. And they produced a number of pages that were fine, that worked, and they supplied them to various customers. And then a number of pages that had explosives in them that were supplied to Hezbollah. So that, if that's true, and I think it is, then I think it will turn out to be true, put it that way, then it shows, like all of these operations, that they are years in the planning. These operations take a long time to set up. And what seems to have happened is that the Israelis had this operation moving when Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, told all the Hezbollah people to stop using their mobile phones and go to pages. The Israelis suddenly realized that they could surge production of explosive-filled pages, and this was a great bonus to them, so they supplied them. The same with the other electronic devices, which exploded the following day. The downside for the Israelis is that I'm fairly certain in my own mind, I can't prove this, but just looking at the timing of these explosions, 3:30 on a weekday, was not optimal for the beginning of an attack or an operation. And I think that they probably pressed the button because they knew they were about to be exposed. As a major intelligence asset, if it looks as if it's about to be blown by the other side, then you have to activate it there and then or lose it. So it was a use it or lose it moment on Tuesday last week. And I think that they pressed the button, and that has created a series of events which the Israelis are now trying to take advantage of. So I think those explosions created a sense of retaliation in Lebanon. The Israelis have preempted the retaliation with air attacks overnight. We will see what happens in the next 24 hours. But I'm fairly certain in my own mind that although these exploding pages were intended as the first, if you like, a personal artillery barrage to open a campaign, I bet they didn't intend to open that campaign at 3:30 last Tuesday afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Clark, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
I wish you all the best. My heart is with you.
Thank you very much.